Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello, my guest is Ronald Stein. He is founder of PTS Advance and is called an ambassador for energy and infrastructure. He's a professional engineer, a policy advisor for the Heartland Institute, and a national TV commentator on energy and infrastructure with Rick Amato. He has published numerous op-ed articles as a columnist, and he has co-authored 3 books: Energy Made Easy, helping citizens become energy literate; Just Green Electricity, helping citizens understand a world without fossil fuels; and his newest book, Clean Energy Exploitations, helping citizens understand the environmental and humanity abuses that support clean energy, which was recently a Pulitzer Prize nominated book. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be aboard.
We have a lot to talk about in terms of how we can solve our energy crisis, which we both agree there is one. However, in reading your book, there are many areas where I disagree with you, and I want to understand your perspective and your solutions to the energy crisis. Let's begin with the cover of your new book, Clean Energy Exploitations, because it's very provocative. You have a soldier with an AK-47 machine gun overseeing the mining of minerals in one of the developed countries. Why did you choose this picture for the cover?
Todd Rowe and I talked about that quite a bit, because you're right, it is very provocative, but it does, in one picture, tell the story. You've heard of blood diamonds. Basically, the exotic minerals and metals are becoming blood minerals, because all the exotic minerals and metals to go green are in those developing countries that have yellow skin, brown skin, black skin people, and they have no environmental controls and no labor controls, and they're being exploited. There's, a lot of stuff is being mined by kids by hand. The photograph basically shows, that's a photograph taken in Africa, that there's a family, kids and adults, mining for the exotic minerals and metals so that the wealthy and healthy countries can go green with the solar panels and wind turbines and EV batteries. So the same less developed countries, they're mining, they're the ones being exploited, and that photograph kind of said it all. It is stark and attention grabber, but it summarizes what's in the book.
That's one area where we disagree, is you're very supportive of fossil fuels. I am very supportive of renewable energies such as electricity and solar and biomass, if done correctly. And that's where we do agree that the renewable energies are not always as green as we think they might be.
Well, Nancy, I'm not supportive of fossil fuels.
I stand corrected.
I'm agnostic. Fossil fuels are there. I would love to find a way to replace fossil fuels. There's 3 fossil fuels. There's coal, natural gas, and oil. Coal and natural gas are used for generating electricity. And presently, there might be an opportunity for solar panels and wind turbines to generate electricity. Hopefully, they can do it on a more continuous basis. But oil is never used for electricity. We don't need oil. Oil is useless, totally useless, unless it is manufactured into something that the public demands.
You indicated in your book that there are 6,000 products from oil?
Correct.
Not just gasoline.
No, a barrel of oil, half of it is used to generate oil derivatives, what makes 6,000 products. Everything in the medical industry is made with oil derivatives. iPads, iPhones, motors, defibrillators are made with the derivatives from oil. And the other half of the barrel is used to make fuel. Now, presently, fuel is the subject that's going on, because if you have an EV battery, your Tesla might be able to run, but batteries do not make any energy. They just store energy. An EV battery is good for lightweight, short-range transportation. The fuels that come out of oil are for the heavyweight, long-range, for airplanes, ships, the military, the space program. If it wasn't for the demand for oil products, there'd be no need for oil. Oil has to be refined to be useful.
We do have to look to some alternatives. When you do your revised edition, I wish you would have an appendix of those 6,000 products. It would be interesting to see what they really are. We know, though, that plastics, for example, do come from petroleum products, and plastics have posed serious problems for our ecosystems and our wildlife.
Well, let me just mention just a couple. Asphalt for the roughly 65 million miles of roads in the world, tires for the 1.4 billion vehicles in the world, fertilizers that help feed the 8 billion in the world, all the medical supplies and all the medications, the jets that comprise more than 50,000 for the military, commercial, private, and the President's Air Force One, merchant ships, of which there's over 50,000 moving products around the world, and vehicles that are mostly made of plastics. Without oil, you have no vehicles. Without oil, you have no solar panels because they're all made with oil derivatives.
I have always maintained that we should be looking for alternatives to oil, but that we still do need some oil, but we shouldn't be extracting oil in national wildlife refuges and in wilderness areas and in unique ecosystems that should be preserved and protected for other purposes.
There's pros and cons either way. Like I said, there's no silver bullet answer to our needs, but the demands of society, like say, if society didn't demand to want to fly anywhere at any time in the world or take a cruise ship or, have an operation, if those demands weren't there, we can revert back to our decarbonized society. We had a decarbonized society. We had no oil, we had no coal, we had no natural gas power plants back in 1800s.
You did talk about the time frame of around 1900 and how things changed. Is it because of the Industrial Revolution?
It was oil that put us into the Industrial Revolution because before 1900s, we had no medical industry. We had no electronic industry. We had no communications. We basically had, no transportation because in the 1900s, that's when we invented the automobile, we invented the airplane, and we started to discover what oil was used for, what we could do with it. Consequently, we become, dependent on the products. We like our lifestyle. We like being able to live in any weather condition that Mother Nature doesn't help us with. We have air conditioning, we have heating. Because of the products from oil, we pretty much have eliminated all weather-related fatalities. It's a demand for the products of oil. Like if there's no demand, you don't need oil. You can stop drilling.
We know that previous uses of fossil fuels have created a lot of pollution problems. How do we avoid making those same mistakes when we continue to use fossil fuels?
Well, Nancy, I don't think we've made the mistakes. I think we've made improvements. If you take a look at the early refineries, they were smokers. They were just polluting. Now that we have, technology, we have been able to refine it and reduce the emissions and, quote, clean up the act of refineries. Same thing automobiles. Automobiles were smokers. They're just polluting everything and getting, 8 miles to a gallon. Today, gasoline cars are pretty clean. They're getting like 40 miles to a gallon, and they're pretty clean. So when you take a look under the hood of the 1930s car, there was very little under there. It was just an engine. Today, you can barely put a lunch bucket in there. It's so packed with all these environmental controls. So we have, cleaned up the act with technology. When you make the same mistakes, I think we've made tremendous progress because we've increased the longevity of people from 30 to 80 plus. We've eliminated virtually all weather-related fatalities. Now we have, medical industry. I think it's a totally different world. We are much better off in the healthy, wealthy countries because we have benefited from oil. The developing countries that have, more than 6 billion people, they don't have what we have. We can bring them out of poverty more efficiently.
You discussed extensively the problems with electric vehicles, which the Green Movement is certainly advocating. You talked about the intermittent and non-reliable use of electricity, particularly for vehicles to go longer miles because of the storage issue. Can't our technology improve that so that it is more viable?
It will improve when, how many decades of that I don't know. The EV profile is a healthy, educated person, well compensated, probably has a house that they can park the car in to charge it. Most people don't live in a house. Most people are parking their cars on the street. When you consider you drive around these busy streets, all these cars parked everywhere, can you envision them being EVs and extension cords laying everywhere? Being able to park close to your house, it's going to be a logistical nightmare. There will be improvements in EV batteries, but I'm not sure that, all the EV manufacturers, they're going all in. All the automobile manufacturers by 2035, they're almost not going to be producing internal combustion engines, just EVs. Nancy, I have a personal fear. I think the auto industry is going to hit a major financial hit because the population, they can't afford two vehicles. They're not going to buy it unless it's a workhorse vehicle. And, charging capabilities, range capabilities all fit into the picture. I think it's going to be a rude awakening for the auto industry. I think they're being legislated into producing EVs because they have to produce less emissions from their vehicle assembly line, and the way to do that is to not make an internal combustion engine.
The area that I believe totally agree on is that people want the benefits of modern technology. We want the benefits of electricity. And unfortunately, all the current sources have environmental problems, whether or not they're fossil fuels, whether or not they're renewables. I'm particularly concerned about wildlife, ecosystems, wild areas. I don't want our wild areas, wildlife refuges, having drilling for oil. I don't want to see our rivers dammed for hydroelectric power. So what do you predict for the future in the next 5, 10, 20 years that will provide us with that electricity and be good for the environment?
Well, 2 points I want to make. One is electricity can charge your iPhone, but it can't make your iPhone. It can make the defibrillator work, but it can't make the defibrillator. It can run a motor, but it can't make the motor. Electricity is beneficial, but it has limitations because it basically needs oil. What we have done in the last 100 years, we've improved efficiencies, we've improved utilization, and we've improved, I think, conservation, and I think educating the public to be conservative because there's not enough lithium in the world to build a billion batteries. So we know we can't go down that route either. Crude oil that's there, we're discovering how to get it. Take California. There's billions of barrels of crude oil offshore. And with current technology, you slant drill. There's no offshore drilling. Taking advantage and extending the life of the limited amount of oil that the world has for the next billion years, I think we've done great progress, and I think that's the area we want to focus on is continue to improve upon that progress. Efficiency and conservation are really controlled by humanity.
When I became an environmentalist in the late 60s, I was very aware in college of the Santa Barbara oil spill in 1969 and how it impacted our coastline, impacted our economy, our tourist economy, impacted the wildlife, impacted so many different things. So to me, I have not wanted oil drilling along our coast for decades. It seems to me that we do have to find some alternatives. I have a family that came from West Virginia and suffered from black lung disease because they were miners in the coal mine. They need to transition to another kind of work.
Nancy, the Santa Barbara oil spill was a measured quantity of oil, but there's natural leakage, which is never measured because it's natural. The natural leakage has exceeded the Santa Barbara oil spill over the decades, but it's not recognized because it's a natural leakage. It's not going away.
One of the areas where we may have a disagreement is that in terms of population, because I firmly believe that if we reduced our population, if we had a better carrying capacity on this planet, people could enjoy the modern technologies and it wouldn't be so destructive. We can't continue to have a growing population putting more demands for consumer resources, consumer products, and more technologies.
There's a big argument about that. Can the world really support the 8 billion we have on Earth? Because the world was like about 1 billion people for decades and centuries. And right around the mid-1800s, when we discovered fossil fuels, and primarily the oil that gave us everything that we now have in our daily lives, the world populated in about 150 years from 1 billion to 8 billion. And now we have 8 billion people. You need all these merchant ships to move products all over the world to be able to feed them and keep them alive.
You talk about China and India, which has 35% of the world's population. That's 2.5 billion people. And they want to have a better lifestyle. And the issue to me is that these people who haven't developed the lifestyle that we're used to in the United States, whether or not they're in Asia, Africa, or elsewhere, should be going green and not making the same mistakes we are in terms of the destructive energy developments that we've had. I've opposed dams on our wild rivers, but yet they're advocated for hydroelectric power, and yet I support removing some of those dams to have wild and free-flowing rivers again. How do we tackle that?
You have to take a look at the big picture. You're right. There's 8 billion people on Earth, and 80% of them, that's more than 6 billion, are living on less than $10 a day. Nancy, they haven't joined the Industrial Revolution. They're still living in the 1800s. They're still living in a decarbonized society. They would like to improve their lives. Presently, because they've got no money, they can't subsidize themselves out of a paper bag. The most affordable, abundant, reliable source of energy they have is coal. And China and India have coal-fired power plants. They're building 600 more. Africa's going to be building 1,200 more. They're going to electricity. Now, when you take a look at that developing part of the world, there's 11 million kids dying every year from malnutrition, starvation, diarrhea, diphtheria. Everything is preventable if they had access to the medical that we in the wealthy countries have access to.
I'm certainly very aware of it because I'm helping build a school and orphanage in Kogelo, Kenya, and they're begging for just a motorbike or a vehicle to take the kids to the health clinic, which is 12 miles away, that they can't get to.
Right. That's most of the world. It's only the healthy, wealthy countries that have the ability to have an economy to subsidize to get electricity from wind and solar. Yeah, most of the world is not in that kind of predicament.
But it seems to me that to get them to have the electricity, the benefits that we have of a modern society, they could maybe bypass some of our mistakes, because I'm based here in Southern California and I'm well aware of how polluted the air was until we started getting regulations and restrictions to clean up our air, to clean up our water. We're putting toxics into the environment, and if they just introduce the same thing that we had, they're going to have the same problems that we've had, and that they need to maybe jump over it. And places like Puerto Rico, after the earthquake and the hurricanes, could have done better if they put up the solar panels and had electricity right away, rather than depending on an infrastructure that was dependent on other sources.
Well, you're caught between a rock and a hard place, because you can't have solar panels and wind turbines without an oil refinery to make the derivatives that's going to make the products that make the solar panels that make the wind turbines.
Yes, that is definitely a problem. And I want to talk more about these energy issues when we return in a moment with my guest, Ronald Stein, who is founder of PTS Advance and co-author of Clean Energy Exploitations, helping citizens understand the environmental and humanity abuses that support clean energy. We'll return in a moment.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Ronald Stein, who is a columnist and commentator on energy and infrastructure. We're talking about your new book, Clean Energy Exploitations. One of the areas where I totally disagree with you, and I wish that you had gone in more detail in your book, was your support of nuclear power, because I didn't see you really discussing the disadvantages, such as the radiation that is so problematic. I mean, we know Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. We have to deal with the radiation problems when these nuclear power plants are disabled.
Nancy, you know how many people have died in America from nuclear since its inception, about 30, 40 years ago? None, and no fatalities. And even with Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, in the 30 or 40 years, the amount of fatalities, I think, is like 20 or 30 people. But when you take a look at the alternatives, there is no silver bullet answer. Pulitzer. You're not going to get zero fatalities of anything. You get people falling off wind turbines. But no, it's zero-emission electricity. There's like 450 nuclear power plants being built right now in the world.
That's a whole nother book that we could discuss in the future, but what I would like to do is discuss some of the areas that you did explore in your book, and you were very strongly opposed to California, Australia, Germany, and these states and nations having a go-green economy.
Well, Nancy, I wasn't opposed to them. I'm just trying to bring out the reality. Germany was the first country to go green, and today they have the highest cost of electricity in the world. Australia was the second country to go green. When I say green, we're talking about focus on solar panels and wind turbines and getting rid of coal-fired power plants, getting rid of natural gas power plants, and even getting rid of nuclear. Those countries have gotten rid of nuclear, and they're just all into breezes and sunshine for their electricity. That Germany's got the highest cost of electricity. Australia's right behind them. California's right behind Australia and Germany. The cost of electricity goes up, and inflation and shortages everywhere.
But what I have been concerned about in the United States is a major focus on cost. And I have always maintained that we have false economies. We do not include in our cost of our energy the side effects, whether or not it's the pollution or the exploitation that we talked about at the very beginning about mining and obtaining the various sources of energy. And gasoline in the United States has always been cheap, whereas in Europe it wasn't. And if we had really priced the cost of gasoline and the cost of the pollution and the health effects, maybe we would have a decent public transportation system in the United States. Maybe we'd have that bullet train from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Maybe we would have rail systems and bus systems that we could take. That we have a false economy looking at just the price of gasoline and how much we drive.
Well, getting back to your original question about Germany and Australia, they've subsidized themselves into renewables. And as we talked about before, the 80% of the world, they can't subsidize themselves out of a paper bag. So how is the developing countries going to be able to subsidize wind turbines and solar panels when they can't subsidize themselves out of a paper bag?
Wouldn't it be better if the United States helped invest in health, education, and good development of infrastructure so they could do so rather than giving them bombs and planes and weapons?
Oh, I agree with you 100% on that, because you're right. The wealthy countries, especially the United States, we like to, I use the term, leak the responsibility somewhere else.
You talked about that extensively for California, that if we go electric, we're actually pushing the emission costs onto other areas.
Exactly. Same thing even with oil.
Could you explain why you believe that California is actually exporting their emissions?
In 95, California was drilling for oil. It's right here in California, and we brought in oil from Alaska. That made up 95% of the state's demand for oil to make products and other fuels. In 95, that was 5%. Today, because California keeps reducing their in-state production, and now we're basically importing like 58% of our oil from foreign countries. We're talking about like Saudi Arabia, which is like 25,000-mile round trip. We're basically bringing in tankers. I think we brought in about 500 million barrels of oil over the year. It takes like 100 ships with 500,000 barrels each. And each ship, maritime pollution is the worst in the world. In fact, the ships that bring in the oil to California are emitting enough greenhouse gas emissions about 200 times the entire California annual fleet of vehicles can produce annually. So we don't drill here, we let them drill somewhere else, and they bring it to us by maritime ships, which use the cheapest fuel around. And pollution's atrocious. Same thing with going green. You want basically lithium and cobalt, to make batteries and wind turbines and solar panels. If you mine for it here, it'd be less expensive. We don't do that.
One of the areas where I think we have some agreement is the issue that you explored. You call it racial biasing. Many environmentalists call it environmental justice, where we're concerned about the poorer people getting a worse impact over changing to other kinds of green economies. Yet you and I both believe that the billionaires are rather hypocrites when they have huge carbon footprints but want everyone else to reduce emissions that impact the green movement. So I would like to see billionaires be taxed more. I would like to see all people, poor, middle class, and upper class, wealthier people, all benefit from the green movement.
I'm not sure that's possible, Nancy, because let's take a look at EVs. California is the EV capital of America. Of all the EVs in the entire country, half of them are in California. We have the most temperate climate, and when you take a look at the EV ownership, the profile is it's highly educated people, high-income people, people that have second cars, because EV is not the primary workhorse vehicle for the family, and they don't use the car very much. EV owners generally average about 5,000 miles a year. They drive it as much as they drive their Lamborghini. When you take a look at EVs, because they're not the primary workhorse vehicle, it's tough on the lower class people because most people can barely afford one car, let alone two cars. And if it's not the workhorse vehicle, they're not going to buy it at all. It's a tough situation because, and now we're talking only in the healthy and wealthy countries. Forget about the developing countries. Take a look at California. Half of California is Hispanic and African American, and they tend not to be in the profile of the EV owners. When you subsidize electricity, like they've done in Germany, like they've done in Australia, like they're doing in the UK, the price of electricity goes up, the price of fuel is going up, and if you're flipping burgers, that's tough. Subsidizing works great if you have a wealthy economy, but the ones that aren't in that category, they take it in the shorts.
It's really difficult for all people to make transitions to try to make our planet healthier. I think in that regard, we both agree that we need to solve an energy crisis and do it hopefully as sustainably and environmentally sound as possible. We don't have a lot of time left, and perhaps it's good because you spent a lot of time in your book talking about the politics, and we may disagree there because I personally think that all political parties don't have the best program and plan to tackle the climate change, tackle the energy crisis. And you did talk about current policies, plans with the current administration, a little bit about the past administration. Both political parties haven't, to me, done all that they could or should do. But I think at this point, since a war is happening in Europe, we should talk about national security implications of going green. I think that it would be valuable because we can't depend on oil from places like Russia.
We don't have a replacement for oil. That's probably the biggest problem the world has. Because if you want to, divesting in fossil fuels, which is the ESG movement, as I talked about before, there's three fossil fuels. There's coal, natural gas, and oil. You might be able to subsidize yourself out of coal and out of natural gas if you can get wind and solar to produce the way they are producing through coal and natural gas. We've had over 150 years to come up with a clone to oil, and we haven't.
You have certainly explored these issues in your new book, Clean Energy Exploitations, helping citizens understand the environmental and humanity abuses that support clean energy. It was a very interesting read because I'm used to reading books that I totally 100% agree with the author, and this was challenging for me. And I think that you brought up some interesting points, and I want to thank you so very much for sharing them with us during this program.
My website's energyliteracy.net. All my articles are there, the books are there.
Thank you for being my guest.
Thank you, Nancy.
I have been speaking with Ronald Stein, who is founder of PTS Advance. He's called an ambassador for energy and infrastructure. He's a professional engineer, a policy advisor for the Heartland Institute, and a national TV commentator on energy and infrastructure with Rick Amato, as well as being a published columnist of op-ed articles and co-author of previous books, Just Green Electricity, Helping Citizens Understand a World Without Fossil Fuels, and Energy Made Easy, helping citizens become energy literate. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.